Hi, welcome to the TC. My name's David, and today we're going to be taking a look at arguably one of the worst iPads ever made, the iPad 3rd generation. Released in 2012, the 3rd generation iPad was one of the biggest releases for the iPad, bringing the Retina display to the iPad for the first time. However, it was overshadowed by the iPad 4 released just a mere 7 months later. So, what went wrong? Let's dive into the iPad 3 and see why it is often regarded as one of the worst iPads ever released. When the iPad 3 was first released, it was actually pretty amazing on paper. It featured the 9.7-inch Retina display for the first time on an iPad, and this display was honestly a huge upgrade from the low pixel density of the iPad 2. Also, it included the A5X chip, which was a quad-core graphical chip based off of the original A5 chip that was in the iPad 2. It also featured a 5-megapixel camera for the first time on the rear, allowing for 1080p video. All of these things considered, the iPad 3 honestly sounded like a really great upgrade coming from the iPad 2. Apple also claimed that the iPad 3 was twice as powerful in graphical performance over the iPad 2. So, on paper, the iPad 3 sounded like a really great deal. The biggest feature that Apple pushed was actually the Retina display on the iPad 3 though, and that's for good reason. It was 4 times the pixel density as what we had on the iPad 2. And honestly, this display even today still looks pretty great. But that makes sense though, because this display size, 9.7 inches, with the Retina display, didn't really change on the iPad until the iPad 7th generation, when they finally switched to a 10.2 inch display. This was a really exciting upgrade at the time, but it did cost something, that being the performance. The A5X was an enhanced version of the A5 chip used on the iPad 2 as well as the iPad mini and the iPhone 4S. It also featured 1GB of RAM for the first time, making this the highest RAM device that Apple made running iOS. However, while the graphical performance of the iPad 3 was improved over the iPad 2, it did feature basically a very similar processor to the iPad 2. The dual-core A5 was still present on the iPad 3 even in the A5s. The only real difference was having more RAM and more graphical power by having a quad-core graphics versus dual-core. This is where the problems would begin to show though. The GPU on the iPad 3, while being twice as powerful as the iPad 2, also had to push 4 times the resolution. As a result, a lot of those graphical gains really went towards running this high-resolution display. This became really obvious in instances like gaming though, where in some cases some people had higher graphical settings on the iPad 2 versus the iPad 3, simply because more of the resolution of the iPad 3 was being utilized by the GPU versus being able to have higher graphical settings. So the GPU on the iPad 3 actually had to work a lot harder than the iPad 2, even though it was twice as powerful. Another issue with the iPad 3 was the heat. Because it had such a powerful chip running the display, it also meant that that power had to dissipate heat. And one of the complaints about the iPad 3 was that it did get quite a bit noticeably hotter than the iPad 2. This wasn't such a big complaint or like a safety issue, however it is something to note. Users would report things like web browsing or playing games would heat up the device a lot more often than you'd get with the iPad 2. In my head though, this actually was kind of an early sign that Apple may have pushed out the Retina display a little too early, making the iPad 3 kind of obsolete from the beginning. Even though it did have a very high resolution display and a faster graphical chip, it also meant that the A5 was being pushed to its limits. And honestly, Apple was probably banking on the Retina display selling the iPad 3. And, they actually weren't wrong. In the first 3 days, the iPad 3 actually sold 3 million units. So that's nothing to scoff at. Unfortunately though, for the customers of the iPad 3, this was actually the shortest lived iPad that Apple ever released. Well, why is that? The iPad 4 came into the question. The iPad 4 basically fixed a lot of the complaints that people had with the iPad 3, notably the performance. The iPad 4 featured the A6X chip, which was significantly faster in both CPU and GPU performance over the iPad 3, and as a result, it was definitely able to handle that Retina display a lot better than what the iPad 3 could. Along with the faster processor, Apple also switched over to the Lightning connector on the bottom, phasing out 30-pin. If anything, the iPad 3 is actually the last iOS device to feature a 30-pin connector. This left many iPad 3 owners feeling betrayed and frustrated, as they had just spent hundreds of dollars on this device, only to be phased out just 7 months later. People who bought the iPad 3 suddenly found themselves stuck with a device that was already outdated, and succeeded by a device that was much more powerful and actually able to handle the display without heating up. This actually led to the backlash of a lot of customers, forcing Apple to have a 30-day return period for people who had bought the iPad 3 30 days prior to the iPad 4's announcement. As if things weren't bad enough though, the iPad 3 only got worse in performance as concurrent iOS updates came out. Each version of the iOS updates would actually make this device slower, and in a lot of ways, it's down to the A5 chip. Apple had forced onto the A5 chip devices more software updates than usual, and as a result, it really pushed what the A5 was capable of. The last software update for the iPad 3 was iOS 9, and iOS 9 running on the iPad 3 is not something that most people would want to have to be their experience. In a lot of ways, it's very glitchy, it's slow, it doesn't want to respond very well. Compare that to something like iOS 6, this device could run iOS 6 a lot better than something like iOS 9. And today, trying to run any apps on iOS 9 is basically impossible. Because the software is so outdated, being able to find apps that work with iOS 9 is next to nothing. So if you wanted to use this iPad for, basic tasks, even then it would be difficult to find apps that even work on this device. I actually have a video talking about why I think the A5 and iOS 9 together killed all of the A5 devices. And if you want to check it out, I'll put it up in the card here. It was actually one of my first videos I ever made for this channel. And I think the reason why I did that is because it's such an interesting thing to think about, because the A5 chip was in a lot of Apple devices at the time. And Apple kind of began the whole long software update process through the A5 chip. But in a way, it wasn't really ready for having that kind of software support. I do think that Apple did learn their lesson though with the iPhone 6 series, where iOS 12 was its last update. And honestly, I feel like we need another iOS 12 moment for the current amount of devices we have today. So let's recap onto why I think the iPad 3 was one of the worst iPads ever released. So 1, it was underpowered from the start. The A5X, while harnessing the more powerful GPU, was pushed a lot harder to run the Retina display, and as a result it would heat up, and it wouldn't really run that much faster compared to the A5 chip on the iPad 2. Number 2, it overheated in normal use. The A5X being pushed to its limits definitely forced the iPad to dissipate more heat, and as a result users did say that their iPad 3s were heating up a lot more compared to the iPad 2. It wasn't nearly enough to be a safety issue, but it was something that was pretty noticeable. Alongside that more power-hungry CPU and GPU, the iPad 3 also featured a larger battery. This also meant, of course, that charging the device also took quite a bit longer, as it had a much larger battery. And, in result of that, also meant more heat. Number 3, it was discontinued in record time. The iPad 4 coming just 7 months after the iPad 3's launch was definitely a punch to the gut for a lot of iPad 3 owners. They thought that their iPad 3s would last at least another year before the iPad 4 would come out. However, Apple decided that they would release the iPad 4 just 7 months after the release of the iPad 3. This meant that a lot of people felt that their iPad 3s were definitely kind of a stopgap product, and in a lot of ways it was. The iPad 4 fixed a lot of the issues that the iPad 3 had, and yeah, honestly, the iPad 4 is what the iPad 3 should have been. And number 4, it aged terribly. The massive amounts of software updates that the iPad 3 held with the A5 chip definitely did not help it in aging gracefully. Even though it had 1GB of RAM, it still wasn't really enough to run iOS 9 sufficiently. And because it had such a high resolution display, and the A5X was already running hard to power that display, it meant that the iPad 3 would struggle with iOS 9. And to be fair, it's not the only device that struggled with iOS 9. Basically, all of the devices that had an A5 chip would struggle on this iOS version. So in many ways, the iPad 3 was a rush product, and it showed. It definitely felt like a stopgap solution to have the Retina display on the iPad out as soon as possible. But it also meant that the iPad 3 was definitely kind of a rush product, and as a result, people would definitely get upset, understandably, about the release of the iPad 4 just 7 months later. However, as a consumer, it would have been difficult to know that the iPad 4 would be released so soon after the release of the iPad 3. So I can't really fault the consumers for believing that the iPad 3 was a pretty good upgrade at the time. And, at the time it actually was. So the iPad 3 would definitely be a trailblazer for some of the most iconic features on the iPad lineup. Featuring the Retina display for the first time was a huge upgrade. and that Retina display basically stuck around for many, many years after. So even with all of its shortcomings, the iPad 3 was a really big influence on the iPad lineup for generations to come, and it was hugely important in establishing how much better the experience of iOS would be on a large screen, high resolution device. So that's going to be it for today's video. Did you guys own an iPad 3, or did you buy one before the iPad 4 came out? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd be interested to see how you guys felt when the iPad 4 came out. Also, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like down below and subscribe to see more content just like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.